When we first started working on databases, I mentioned that we should never hard code our database information or the database URL into our code, because this creates two issues. First of all, we're exposing our username and password right there in code. So anyone can see it. If we check it into GitHub, anyone who has access to it can see our password now. And at that point, we've compromised our application. But on top of that, the other big issue is that right now we've set this URL to go to our development Postgres instance, which is running on our local machine. When we actually deploy this to production, our Postgres server is not going to be running on this machine. It may not even be running on the machine that our application is actually deployed on. It could be on a completely different system. So we would need a way for the code to automatically update in a production environment to point to the actual production Postgres database instead of using the one that's hard-coded in here. And so we need a way to do that. And keep in mind, this isn't exclusive to just working with the databases. Any kind of confidential information, any passwords, secrets, anything that needs to get updated based off of the environment that it's in needs a way. We'll run into this same exact issue. Right? And if we go to our OAuth2.file, you can see that we have our secret key hard-coded in here. This is something that we don't want to do. We don't want to expose this, and we need this to get updated between our development and our production environment because they may not be the same on both. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to make use of something called environment variables. And so an environment variable is just a variable that you configure on a computer. Doesn't matter what operating system, they all support it. And when you configure an environment variable on your computer, any application that's running on that computer will be able to access it. And that includes our Fast API. So your Python app will be able to access any environment variables on the machine. And so instead of hard coding the values in our code, what we'll say is, hey, retrieve an environment variable named, whatever. Like we might have an environment variable called Postgres_URL, and that's going to contain the URL of our Postgres database. And so we don't need to hard code the actual value. We hard code just the name of the variable, and then Python will automatically pull in that variable. So let me show you guys how to do that. And I'm going to show you guys how to do this on Windows first, and then we'll take a look at this on a Mac or a Linux machine. Mac and Linux are the same steps. So I'm going to search for environment, and you'll see this edit the system environment variables. And what we want to do is we want to go to environment variables under the advanced tab. And here you'll see two sections. You've got system variables. This is going to be environment variables that are system wide, which means any user can access them. And then we have user specific variables. So these are variables that only I can access. And you can just kind of, go through these and just take a look at them. But you can see that we have an environment variable called path. Don't worry about what it's used for. This is something that gets set up when you install your machine. But we're going to take a look and try to access this. So you can see that this is the key, the variable name path, and then the value is some sort of path in our operating system or in our file system. So how do we actually access that? Well, let's open up a terminal. And here I'm just going to type in echo. And then we want to access an environment variable, just do % and then the name of the variable. So I'll say path with a capital P. And if I run this, you can see that it prints out that specific path. And so that's how you access an environment variable on the command line. With Python code, it's going to be a little bit different, but it's still pretty simple. I'm going to open up a new file just for demonstration purposes. You don't have to actually follow along on this. And to actually access a environment variable, we have to import the OS module. And then to access that variable, you say os.get nv. And then within this method, you just pass in the name or the key of the variable. So in this case, it's path. And I'm just going to store this in a variable, and we can call this anything. I'll just call this path. Why not? And then I'll print out path so we can see if it actually works. So now if I do pi-3 and then run example.py, you can see that it printed out that same exact path. Now to set a new environment variable, we would go to new. And maybe I create a URL, a variable name called Postgres. Or we can just call this, how about my_db _URL. So this is going to have the URL to access our database. So I'm going to say this is at localhost :5432. I think that's what our database is running on. And I'll hit OK. And so here we can see that this is our new environment variable that we created, my_db_URL, and it's set to localhost 5432. I'll hit OK. and then I'll hit OK here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to try to access that variable. So I'll do echo my underscore db underscore URL percent. And actually it should be %%. And you can see that it does not print out what we said. It just prints out exactly what we wrote. So what gives? What happened here? Well, anytime you set a new environment variable, what you got to do is you got to close out your terminal and open up a brand new one. So I can close this out, or I can just open up a new one. And this new terminal, well, actually, I don't want a PowerShell. I want a command prompt. So this new terminal will be able to access newly created environment variables because they get set as soon as the terminal opens. So once the terminal's open, I can't change them. So I have to open up a new one so that it can reread and import all of those environment variables. So now if I do echo %my underscore db underscore URL %, it looks like I may have mistyped this. So hold on, let me see what it's called. And that looks like it's correct. So what's happening? Well, I'm going to close out all of them. That's probably what's the issue. So let me open up a new terminal. And I'll open up a new command prompt. And now I'm going to try echo %my underscore db underscore URL. And now we can see that we can read it. So we have to close out our terminals and open up a brand new one. It's kind of annoying, but that's just the way it works. Now, on top of that, there's an even bigger issue, and I think this is exclusive to Windows. And that is that VS Code, the terminals here, it's whenever you set a new environment variable, they never have access to it. So you could try deleting all of these terminals and then creating a new terminal and then accessing that new environment variable, my db underscore URL. And if I try to run this code, you'll see that it just says none. And if I just try to run the same echo command here, you'll see that it just spits it out. So it's not able to read it, and it's a little bit of an annoying issue with VS Code in Windows. You have to close out every single VS Code window that you have and then reopen them. And sometimes even then that doesn't fix the issue. So know that this is just kind of a limitation with Windows. But ultimately, don't worry too much about that because you're going to see that, especially in a development environment, going into and actually setting all of these variables yourself is unnecessary, right? I don't want to have to go in and set one for my database IP, my database port, as well as my secret key, my password, my username. That's just too many to manage yourself. And you'll see that more complex applications could have 10, 20, 30 environment variables that need to be set. So instead of going into your system and actually changing it, I'm going to show you guys in the next video. I'm going to show you guys how we can get around this by using what's referred to as an environment file. And so you don't actually need to worry about the limitations we're running in here because we're never actually going to set our own environment variables on our local machine, especially in our development machine, because it's just too slow of a process and it makes things unnecessarily difficult to troubleshoot. So before we wrap things up, if you want to delete that environment variable, feel free to do that, which we can just go here and I can just select that and then hit delete. And let me show you guys how to do this on a Mac. To set an environment variable on a Mac machine, the command that we run in the terminal, there isn't a GUI kind of like in Windows. We actually have to use a terminal, which I actually prefer. What we do is we just type in the command export, and then we provide the name of the variable or the key. So I'll say my underscore db underscore URL. Then we say equals, and then we just provide the text, the value. So in this case, maybe this is localhost 5432. All right, and then to actually read the environment variables that have been set, you type in print nv. And here we can take a look at all the environment variables. Most of these have been set by the machine itself. And you'll see that nowhere in here do we see, well, actually we do see my DB URL right here. However, just like I said in Windows, sometimes, depending on the terminal you're using and a few other things, sometimes you actually have to close out this terminal and open up a new one to actually get the new environment variable. But here we can just access it by typing echo, and then we could just say $my underscore db underscore URL. and you can see it prints it out. And then within Python, just like we did on the Windows machine, accessing it is the same exact way. It shouldn't matter which operating system you're on. It's the same exact thing from your code's perspective. With any project, there's going to be a certain number of environment variables. And as I said, as your project grows, you're going to have more and more of them. And one of the issues that you can run into is that you could potentially forget to set one of them, either on your development environment or your production environment, and it's probably going to cause your application to crash. And so what would be good is to perform some sort of validation to ensure that all of the right environment variables have been set for your application to actually run properly. And on top of that, it's important to understand that when you read an environment variable, it's always going to come out as a string, which is fine, but it just means that you have to do all of the validation in code. So if you're setting an environment variable for your access token expire minutes, right? We needed this to be an int, not a string. But when we read the environment variable, it's going to come out as a string. So we have to convert this to an integer. So when it comes to verifying that all of the properties are set, as well as performing validation, we might have already kind of addressed this issue with a different part of our application, right? And that's our schemas, right? We do the same thing with all of the data we send in the body by using Pydantic to perform all of that verification to make sure that every single property that we need is there, and to also perform all of the typecasting. So if we set it something to be an integer, it'll automatically convert it and validate it that it is a valid integer. And what's great about Pydantic is we can actually use Pydantic to perform all of that validation for our environment variables. And let's see how we can actually do that. So I'm going to go to main.py. And as an example, I'm just going to import from the Pydantic library something called base settings. And so just like with any other Pydantic model, right, we can set up a class. And I'm going to call this settings. And this is going to extend base settings. And I didn't mean to accidentally import base. And here we can basically just provide a list of all of the environment variables that we need set as properties on the class itself. And so, maybe I need something called database underscore password. And this needs to be of type string. And we can even give it a default value, which is localhost. And then maybe I need a database username, which is going to be string. And we can give it, once again, a default password. We don't actually have to give it a default value, but if you want to, you can. And I'll say this is going to be Postgres. And then maybe we want the secret key. And this is once again going to be a type string, and we can just give it, some arbitrary default. And let's say these are the only environment variables that we need for our application to run. By setting it like this, it's going to automatically perform all of the validation for us to ensure that all of these have been set. And an important thing to understand is that when you set environment variables, if we just quickly go back to the environment variables on my machine, normally best practice for environment variables is to do all caps with underscores, right? It doesn't have to be all caps, but this is just kind of standard convention. You can see I've got some that aren't like that, but in general, you want to do it all caps. And you can see here, we reference it all in lowercase. So Pydantic will automatically handle all of this from a case insensitive perspective. So it doesn't matter if you capitalize this or lowercase everything. It'll take all of your environment variables and it'll convert it to lowercase just to simplify everything. Then we create a variable called settings equals, and then we say settings. So right here, all we're doing is we're creating an instance of this settings class. And so at this point, Pydantic will read all of these environment variables. And once again, it'll look for them from a case insensitive perspective. So it doesn't matter if they're capitalized or not. And then it's going to perform all of the validation. It's going to ensure that they're properly a string and so on. And then finally, it's going to store it in a variable called settings. So then we can access all of these variables by just saying settings dot and then the name of the property. So if I want to get the database password, I just do settings.database password. And so we can print this out. And I'll just start my application. Right? And you can see that it printed out localhost. And if I want to grab maybe the username, I just say username. Actually, sorry, it should be database underscore username. And you can see it prints out Postgres, which is the default values because I haven't actually set my system environment variables to be any of these values. So it's going to use the default one. And like I said, we're going to run into that Windows issue where I can't exactly update it without closing everything. So I'm not going to bother doing that. But what I will do, just to show you how this validation works, is let's remove this. Let's say there's no default password. And so if there's no default password, then it's first going to check my system, my system or user environment variables to see if there's something called database password. And since I didn't provide a default one, if there is no environment variable with that name, it's going to throw an error because the whole point of this is to validate that all of the environment variables that we have are configured here. And so after I save it, if we take a look at this, you can see that we get one validation error for settings. So settings, database password, and we can see that it's missing. Right? And so having that quick check makes our life so much easier so that we don't have to figure out, which environment variable is missing, which one's not. Because like I said, you could have 10, 20, 30, 40 of them. There's going to be a lot of them, and managing them does become a little bit of a challenge. Now, one quick thing, let's say I go to my environment variables once more, and I've got something called path, right? So path is, the path to a specific directory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want to access the path, but we're going to say that this needs to be of type int. So Pydantic is going to perform some validation. It's going to read it, and every environment variable is always read as a string, and then it's going to try to typecast it into an int. And if it fails, it's going to throw an error. And so since this is clearly not a integer, it should throw an error. So let's try this out. And we can see that value is not a valid integer. Now, for all of the settings and the environment variables, I usually like to create a separate file to hold all of this information. So under app, I'm going to create a new file called config.py. And I'm going to move all of that code into that file. And then in our main.py file, I'll just import from .config, import settings. Right, so ultimately we're just importing that final class, the instance of the class that we created. Right, and so once again, it's able to perform the validation and it's going to report an error with the path variable. All right, so having it in its own file is going to make things a little bit easier because then we could just go to the config.py file and we'll know exactly where to look for all of our environment variables and all the configs related to our application. The last thing I want to do is let's go ahead and actually figure out what environment variables we want to use moving forward and actually set this up. So we're going to clear out all of these, and I'm going to create one for all of the database related stuff. So database underscore hostname. This is going to be a string by default. We're going to have database underscore port. Once again, a string. We'll have a database password. And then we'll have a database underscore name. So that's the database within Postgres that we're connecting to. We'll need a username. All of these will be strings. And you may be wondering why the port is set to a string, but the reason why it's going to be set to a string is because if we actually take a look at our database connection, it just goes into a URL, so we don't actually ever need to have it be an int. I guess you could make sure that it's a valid port number and then convert it back to a string, but that seems a little unnecessary at that point. Then there's a secret key for our JSON web tokens. We've got the algorithm for assigning our token. And then we have the access token expire underscore minutes, which is going to be an int. All right. And if we save all of this, we should get a whole bunch of errors, and that's okay because none of these have been set. So at this point, you could technically, whether you're on a Windows or a Mac, set these on your machine and get everything to work. But like I said, that is an unacceptable thing to do because that's a lot of work. And we want to simplify things. So what we can actually do is within our fast API directory, we're going to create a new file called .env. So this is kind of standard convention, but this file, and don't forget the dot, this file is going to contain all of our environment variables, so we can set it much easier just by having a file do all of the work. Now in production, you're not going to use this. In production, you're going to actually set it on your machine, but in development, it's perfectly okay to just set everything in here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take all of those environment variables that we defined, and we're going to provide values. And so like I said, in real life, you generally want to capitalize everything, but luckily Pydantic automatically looks at everything from a case-insensitive perspective. And so our database right now is running on localhost, so we can just say localhost. Our database port is going to be 5432. The password, that's going to be whatever you chose to use as your password. It's going to be password123. And we've got our database name. Mine happens to be Fast API, but yours is going to be something different probably. The username, I'm guessing everyone's probably going to be using the default Postgres. The secret key, I'm just going to grab whatever I used in my file. So I'll just grab this. The algorithm is going to be HS256. And then the access token expiration time is going to be set to 30. So we've got all the values set here. And one thing to note, I didn't provide any default values, and you could 100% go ahead and add default values into yours if you want to, but I'm going to leave them as such. And now we have to tell Pydantic to actually import it from our .env file. And the way to do that is inside this class, we just say class config, and we say env_file, and then the path to our specific file. So we say .env. So we'll save this. And I forgot to save my env file. And then I'm going to run this again. And our application should start up with 0 issues. And so hopefully you guys see how easy it is to work with environment variables, especially when you're allowed to set it on a file, so that we don't have to worry about setting it either in the terminal or on a Windows machine, having to go through the GUI to do that. But one thing to keep in mind is that you never want to check this env file into Git, right? Because this has all the credentials for your development environment. Maybe you don't want those to get out, and there's no need to ever check it into Git. So if you create a git ignore file, which is .gitignore, you want to make sure that you put in .env. And we'll come back to the git ignore file when we start working with Git in this course. But you also want to make sure you remove anything with __pycache__, which is all of these, as well as your virtual environment folder. So you want to make sure none of those get checked into Git so they don't get uploaded to your GitHub repo. And just to make sure that everything's working, let's go ahead and just test this out real quick, just to make sure that nothing's broken. And that seems to work. And then if we try to get all posts, everything seems to be working. So we have now successfully moved everything over to environment variables. And actually, sorry, we forgot to do one very important thing. We're not actually using the environment variables right now, because if I actually go to my database, you can see that it's still just a hard-coded value. So we have to make sure we actually update that to use the environment variables. So we're going to change this to be an F string. And then here, this is going to be the username. This is the password. This is the host name. And then this is the database name. And then there's also going to be the port number, which would be right here, which is 5432. I believe that's, yeah, and that's going to be the port number. So what we have to do is, since we're using an F string, I can just remove this and I can say, well, first of all, we have to import our config file so we have access to it. Or we can do from config import settings. Just put a dot there. And now I can just say settings dot database, and then we'll grab the username here. And then for the password, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll say settings.database password. And the host name, this is going to be settings.database hostname. And then this is going to be the port number. And then finally, we've got the actual database name. And I think everything should still work. Just to test this part, let's just quickly log in now. All right, everything still works. So our access to our database is now working just fine. But there's a few other things that I want to update. And keep in mind, if you're using the Postgres driver to actually connect and make queries, then you would just update it here with the settings.whatever. But if we go to our OAuth 2, we can, well, first of all, let's import our config. And we'll change the secret key. This is going to be settings.secret key, not schema, secret key. The algorithm is going to be settings.algorithm. And then finally, this is going to be settings.access token expire minutes. All right, let's reload this. Let's just double check a few things. So let's create a new user. All right, we were able to create a user. Let's log in that user. We're able to log in, and then let's get posts. And we're able to get posts. And let's just double check that there's no errors. So everything looks good. And so now we have successfully migrated all of our code to using environment variables. And so when we move to production, we can just, on the machine, set all of these values that we have inside our config.py file, and it's going to automatically import it and then update those values wherever we reference them.